We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the Darkened Hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald. With me today, a special guest, Adam Taylor. Adam has been researching the events of September 11, 2001 since August of 2007. And from 2010 to 2014, he contributed to the blog Debunking the Debunkers of the 9/11 Truth Movement. He has also contributed technical articles to sites such as AE911truth.org and scientificmethod911.org. He is the author of the AE911 Truth multi-part essay, Debunking the Real 9/11 Myths, Why Popular Mechanics Can't Face Up to Reality. Most recently, he's published a paper on the collapse of the Twin Towers in the April edition of the International Journal of Engineering and Techniques. He also shares the first name of myself, and he studies the opposite. He studies the physics, I study the geopolitics. Adam Taylor, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, Adam.
Sure. But, let's start simple. What made you start getting invested with the September 2001 terrorist attacks to begin with?
Yeah, so to be clear, when 9/11 happened, I was only like 10, so I could not have started researching the events from the very beginning because there's just no way I could have done that. What officially piqued my interest was in 2007 when I was flipping through TV randomly, I came across this documentary on the History Channel that was called 9/11 Conspiracies, Fact or Fiction. And, prior to that, I had heard about conspiracies about 9/11 and didn't really give them a lot of credence. But I hadn't really looked into it very much. And then seeing this documentary, it was, a debunking piece. It was about why these theories aren't true, but at least laid out all these different theories to me, all these different anomalies and problems people had found with the official narrative. And it really piqued my interest. And so I wanted to take a deeper look into it. And so that kind of got me started on researching it. And over the years, I looked more and more into it. Eventually, I got started writing for the site you mentioned, the 9/11 Debunkers blog, because I came across it and thought it was a great site. It was a great research source. And the guy that runs it, my friend, John Michael Talbot, he liked stuff that I was doing. I liked what he was doing. And eventually he asked me if I wanted to come on and write for the site. And I said, sure, I'd love to. And I did a lot of my best work there. At that site, we got to present the evidence for the falsity of the official narrative, but it was also about critiquing not just what the debunkers were saying, but also other truthers, because there's a lot of really bad theories about 9/11 out there. And one of the key goals of the site really was, I think, beyond critiquing debunkers, it really was to just separate out the good info from the bad, separate the wheat from the chaff, and try to focus on just the best evidence that we could that would potentially get us a new investigation. Eventually, I stopped writing at the blog, but I still stayed active in researching 9/11. And since then, just kind of been, independent. I've been brought on by people like A911 Truth to write certain things, and I've volunteered with them. But for the most part, I've just been kind of doing it independently at this point and just trying to do whatever I can and where I can.
Sure. We share a lot in common in this regard because I'm independent. I consider myself independent as well. We started out almost in the same time period, 2006, 2007, but we went two different directions. You studied the physics aspect of the World Trade Center towers. I went with the geopolitics involved, like, say, pre-intelligence regarding the CIA, the NSA, Israelis, and Saudis. and the motivational factors of the people involved with the attacks. Why did you start? What was your background in physics and engineering looking like? Because this is something that you concentrated very fervently on.
Well, I'll say I don't really have a science background. I will admit that, but I have always been a science geek. You know, I find that stuff fascinating. And that's kind of what attracted me to that, because one, I just think science is very fascinating. So this was a very interesting question to look into, you know, what really caused these buildings to collapse. And I've looked into the geopolitical aspect of it too, but I can't say that I'm as well versed in that as, you know, people like you and other people in the movement. Something about the looking into the science of it was something that I kind of could just grasp a little easier to me. It just came more naturally to me, I guess. And I also understand that in the case of looking into the science behind it, science is one of the most, or not the most, objective standard of investigation. And I think that looking into that, regardless of what the answer turns out to be, I want to know what really made these buildings collapse. If it turns out that they did just collapse because of what we were told from the planned impacts and the fires, well, then so be it. But I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's something that I really want to get to the bottom of.
Right, you know, and we share that same commonality regarding our two specific fields, in that we are looking at it with very careful objectiveness, and we aren't persuaded by our worldviews enough to look at only selective evidence.
Right.
Your work actually concentrates on the anomalies surrounding World Trade Center Towers 1, 2, and 7. And what was it that made you question the collapses from the onset? Was it something that you saw? Or was it something that persuaded you in an argument? What was it about it?
Well, it actually, some of it goes back to that initial History Channel piece that I watched, because I think knowing they collapsed, I didn't really know much about it. I don't know anything about, at that point, I didn't know, how buildings are supposed to really collapse if it's due to damage. I didn't know much about demolitions, for example. But I remember one point they made in the History Channel piece. They were talking about the rate that the towers took to collapse. And the point that people in the truth movement in that piece were making is that these buildings collapsed too quickly, in their view, to be explained by just fire and gravity. And that was something that hadn't really occurred to me, because I thought, maybe they did collapse too fast for that to be the explanation. I didn't really know, but they were, basically making the case that, these buildings seem like they came down in time intervals that you would expect from demolition, not from fire and gravity. And in the piece, the answer they gave to that was, well, buildings that are brought down with demolition, they don't start from the top, they start from the bottom. And so they can't be demolitions. And the first thought I had, and you got to keep in mind, this is still when I was totally new to this. I didn't have an opinion one way or the other. I wasn't a truther or anything. I was looking at this as a fence sitter. The first thought I had was, well, wait a minute, that doesn't help to explain how they fell as quickly as they did. That doesn't fix the problem. If anything, it makes it worse, because they started from the top and they still fell in time intervals consistent with buildings brought down in demolition. That's actually sounds like a more anomalous thing. Like, how could they have fallen that quickly if the upper sections have to force down all this mass below them? If it starts at the bottom, I can kind of see why it would fall that quickly, but not if the upper sections have to crush all this structure below. So that kind of, was a red flag for me, and kind of got me thinking, like, well, that's really weird. I don't think that really answers the question. It sounds like there is still a question here about how they fell as quickly as they did.
Right. And you know what? There was a paper published in April of 2009 in which a team of scientists published a paper called Active Thermitic Material Discovered in Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe. It's a very infamous paper. Could you tell us about the findings in this paper and who was behind it?
Yeah, so the paper is, the lead author is Dr. Niels Harrit, a chemist, and other authors on it are people like Stephen Jones. And what they do is, in that paper, they document the finding of what they say are pieces of active thermitic material. They identify it as a form of thermite called nanothermite. and it was recovered from dust samples they got from people who actually collected dust from ground zero after the collapses, in some cases very soon after the collapses, like only like 20 minutes after they came down. And they identified these red-gray chips they found in the dust as being explosive thermitic material, which really should not be there. I mean, there's no reason for this type of material to be in the dust in the World Trade Center. And so they would say that that calls for further investigation as to how that stuff got there.
Yeah. Now, where did it, by the way, just to follow up to that, where did they get the dust samples from?
Well, like I said, I don't remember the exact locations. I'd have to go back and read the paper, but they got them from people who basically just, collected the dust that were there. I know one sample came from a woman named Jeanette McKinley, and a few others. They worked with a total of, I think, 4 dust samples that they got from people. And it was kind of just like a call for people to send them in. They were saying, if people have dust samples, we would like to study them. If you have them, please send them in. And they were able to verify that they did get them from ground zero. It's not like they just got random dust from people. They were able to verify that this was ground zero samples. So as they go into their paper, they do talk about how they were able to verify that, that the chain of custody was accurate and where they got these samples from.
All right, let me play devil's advocate if I dare here.
Okay.
I'll try the best I can. In 2012, there was a microscopy consulting firm called MVA Scientific Consultants, which is from Duluth, Georgia. And they released a study of these chips collected from the World Trade Center dust. And they said that there was no evidence of individual elemental aluminum particles that you would expect to see from a thermite burn. And that they said that the red-gray chips found in the World Trade Center dust at 4 sites in New York City are consistent with a carbon steel coated with an epoxy resin that contains primarily iron oxide and kaolin clay pigments. What would be your response to this finding?
Well, I understand there's some dispute over that. One thing I will say about that report that was commissioned is, I believe it's James Millett was the man who wrote that. It was a little strange because originally that report he put together was going to be submitted for peer review in the same way that the active thermetic material paper was. It never was for some reason. I'm not sure why it was never submitted to peer review. What I would say about his report, there was actually a good summary rebuttal, or at least part of it's a rebuttal to that paper that was put together by my friend John Michael Talbot and another contributor to the Debunkers site for a while, Ziggy Zugum, that goes into this material. I mean, I can actually pull up the paper itself that they put together. And they have a section talking about all the flaws with James Millett's paper. If anybody listening wants to find that, if they go to my old blog that I have, the web address is adamtaylor42.blogspot.com. In the sidebar, if you go down, there is a paper. Their paper is posted there as one of the links. It's titled 9/11 Explosive Material in the World Trade Center Dust by John Michael Talbot and Ziggy Zugum. And it pretty much goes into all the different responses to debunkers who try to say that this material is not active thermetic material. Page 13 deals with Dr. Millett's paper, and then page 18 actually goes into the issue of the elemental aluminum that supposedly wasn't found in these chips.
Hey, you know what? Afterwards, share me that blog link, and I'll post it in the description, if you will, for
sure
to obtain it. All right.
Yes.
So give me your best scenario, if you will, regarding how much of the World Trade Center's towers 1 and 2, because they're the tallest buildings, how much would have to be compromised, and how? Was thermite on all the floors? Was it in half the building? And how could it be applied? And who you believe could have pulled this off without being seen by anyone working in the building?
Sure. So I can go into a little bit of how I think the demolitions were carried out. Now, I can only say this from my own observations and my own speculation.
Right.
I don't know for a fact this is actually how it was done, but this is how I likely think it was done. So I break a little bit from what I think some people in the movement think happened in terms of how the explosives were used in the buildings. A lot of people think that the explosives were used to cut through the columns in the same way that you would see in a traditional demolition. I'm sure many people are familiar with that infamous cut column photo at Ground Zero that's got that diagonal cut. For the record, that was not cut by explosives or thermite or anything. I've felt this way for a long time. I've made the case to people that that was not, it was cut by the cleanup workers. What I think happened, I go along with a theory of demolition that was put forth back in 2007 by Gordon Ross, a mechanical engineer, that the explosives were most likely placed on the weld connections between columns on the floors. That what the explosives actually did was they were used to break the weld connections between columns where they were connected. And doing so has a number of advantages. For one thing, you would only therefore have to load not every floor, but only every third floor, because we know from the limited construction documents that have been released, the core columns were welded at every third floor in the towers. And so you would only really have to load at most like only 1/3 of each tower with explosives. And another part of the reason I think that is that if you look at a lot of the columns in the debris or in the debris pile at Ground Zero, they have the characteristics that look as though they were attacked by explosives. There's another paper that I wrote also at my blog that's titled Collapse or Explosion. And in part of that, I go into this theory that if you had explosives placed that way, when they went off, it would affect the columns in a way that you'd get these like concave ends, that the columns would be like pushed inwards at just the ends of them. And you'd have column ends that also look like they were, discolored, oxidized, possibly in some places. And I also give in the appendice of that paper photographs, many photographs of columns that look like they were affected in exactly this way. We need to obviously be able to look at them more closely to be sure that they were affected by explosives, but the damage is consistent with that scenario. So that's what I think happened. Now, in terms of which columns were actually loaded, this is also something that Gordon Ross talked about. I think that only the 24 outer core columns of the towers were affected, because the core of each tower was comprised of 47 inner core columns, but that core itself was made up of 24 outer core columns and then 23 inner core columns. And I think it was only the outer 24 core columns that they affected, because one, those were the columns that the floors were directly connected to. So if you took out those columns, that's what would cause the floors to collapse, and that would destroy the building's internal stability. And then the only perimeter columns that were affected were the corner perimeter columns. Like if you cut the corners of the perimeter of each tower, that will destroy the external stability of the towers, and it'll cause the walls to just peel out, which if you look at the debris map after the collapses, that's exactly what happened. And that's also part of the reason why you see during the collapse, you see like portions of the cores standing. I think those were only the 23 inner core columns. Gordon Ross did a dimensional analysis of the core of the South Tower after it collapsed, and found that the width of it actually matches the width that you would see from just the 24 inner core columns. So that's the way I think they did it. I think they took out the outer 24 core columns every third floor, and then they cut the perimeter cut the corners of the perimeters to get the walls to peel out like they did.
Just to touch on that speculation, who would be qualified to pull that off, skilled to pull it off?
Well, and again, and this gets into a lot more speculation. This is kind of, an area that we really, really can't know for sure until we get into investigation. I know there is anecdotal evidence that there was work being done on the elevators before the attacks. Ace Elevator Company had done work, this huge elevator modernization in the towers in the 9 months leading up to the attacks. And if you had access to the core columns, or sorry, if you had access to the elevators, you could gain access to the core columns because the elevators were adjacent to the core columns. You could be deep in the towers, and there was also no cameras in the elevator shafts. So it's not like you would be seen by those if you were working in there.
Right. And, this leads into another area that I studied about, Denko Mechanical, which was a offshoot plumbing and heating company which existed in a person's residence. So it was like almost like a fictitious company. For those who don't know, it's about the story of Catherine Smith, the Tennessee employee of the DMV, in which she was giving fraudulent IDs to a bunch of individuals from Jordan and Israel to work inside the United States. And when they were arrested in this FBI sting relating to the fake IDs, it was found out that one individual was holding a World Trade Center pass, and it was dated September 6, 2001, in which he said that he worked for Denko Mechanical, which is a plumbing and heating company. And when they went to the Port Authority, who's the owner of the World Trade Center, they actually said that they had no records of Denko Mechanical. So who knows what could have went on in the elevator shafts with Ace Elevator, and who knows could have been that could have been the subverting the plumbing in regards to the bottom of the World Trade Center. So I mean, speculations abound here, but they're not irrational speculation. There's rational and irrational speculation.
Right. I mean, we lack a lot of information we need to draw that with any kind of draw those conclusions with certainty. And I think that we would have to probably accept that until we would get a new investigation, we probably won't know, like 90% of what actually did happen. But I do think we can at least reconstruct some of it by looking at things like the records of who had access to the towers, and also looking at the state of the debris after the collapses to try to get an idea of how they might have collapsed.
Yeah, and this is the information that we're trying to receive. And by the way, the name of the individual at the pass is Sakir Hamad, who went by the nickname Rocky. But also, just to touch on this, because you touched on this a little bit, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. And it's an infamous video. It was an interview done in September 2006, and you're well aware of it. Danny Joenko, who's a Dutch demolition manager, he was interviewed about his opinions regarding how the towers collapsed. And he claims that World Trade Center 1 and 2 were not, as they stated, as he claims, that they started at the bottom, but, not at the top. But he had some reservations, however, with World Trade Center 7, stating that this is exactly what a demolition collapse would look like. Yet when he was informed about this, that the same building that collapsed on September 11, 2001, he stated it wouldn't be impossible, but it would be very hard. And he drew out this area where their heart would be, where they needed to compromise. I'd like to get your thoughts on the summation that he made here.
Yeah, I am familiar with that. I did see that. And I think that, I think his opinion on the tower should be considered, although it's important to remember that he went into it knowing what happened to the buildings, and the fact that even though I do think they were demolished, they certainly don't look like traditional demolitions. I mean, I will grant that. They definitely don't look like, I think, really any demolition that's been carried out before. So I kind of get how that might, even somebody in the field of that, not to think they're actually demolitions. But, then they showed him Building 7 collapse, not telling him what it was, just to get his opinion on the collapse overall. And yeah, he said, oh, well, yeah, of course that was a demolition. And then, yeah, like you said, when they told him that it was also on 9/11, he couldn't believe it. It's like, wait, really? And in his opinion, when they talked to him about it, yeah, he felt like it wasn't impossible that they could have brought the building down. Now, my understanding is that his personal opinion is he thought they demolished Building 7 for safety reasons. I don't think he thought there was a real conspiracy behind it. He thought they probably brought it down for like safety concerns. But he was actually, and it's important to remember too, that he was contacted even after that interview and was asked if his opinion had changed. And he said, no. He said that he looked at the drawings, the construction, people sent him other videos from different angles, and he still said, no, that was a demolition. I still think that definitely was a demolition. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think whether or not that building was demolished is going to rest on just his word alone. We have to look at the science behind it. But it is interesting when you get a real unbiased opinion from somebody who's an expert in the field. I think that's definitely worth considering.
Yeah, and we agree with this. So this is something that I've always wanted to entertain, is that I would love to get somebody from the demolition industry who is not invested with the debunking or the truthing of 9/11, the 9/11 movement, and to get somebody to look at either the blueprints or the outlines or videos of the World Trade Centers on September 11, 2001, to get his estimation about what appeared to have happened. But like and this is something that I wish architects and engineers could have pushed a little bit more, instead of just concentrating on just droning on about World Trade Center 7 for so long, is that they should have tried a little bit more, and this is just my opinion, but I think they should have tried a little bit more to get the opinions of other people in the demolition industry. I know they have Tom Spellman, and if I'm correct, he's a former demolition
Sullivan.
Sullivan.
Yeah, Tom Sullivan. Yeah.
I wish they could have got more people from his background. Would that be something that you'd be agreeing to?
I would. I think they do have a few more people in the group who might not be like strictly building demolition experts, but they do have people who have worked with explosives to demolish other types of structures. I'd have to go back and look at their roster of people. I think a few of them are interviewed in their film they put out, Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. So they do have more than just Tom Sullivan, people who are experts in explosives, as far as I know. It's not a high percentage, I guess, but yeah, I would certainly welcome them to try to get more people in that field involved. But I still think that coming from their area of expertise, which is engineering and physics, they can still make a pretty decent summation that, yeah, the physics doesn't allow these buildings to collapse just from gravity and fire.
And I'll ask you a question I asked David Chandler too in my very first interview. Why isn't there more people in the engineering and architecture community joining up with architects and engineers?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that many of them are probably still not aware of the kind of problems that have been found with the official explanations of why these buildings have collapsed. I mean, we shouldn't assume that just because they haven't voiced support for a 9/11 truth or just the truth movement in general, that doesn't necessarily mean that they endorse the explanations given by NIST, for example, because I mean, I have no idea how many engineers in the world have actually read the NIST report. I don't know. And regardless of if you agree with what they found, it is true, I think, that people in the movement do tend to go through things like the NIST report with a bit of a finer comb than you see with other people who maybe aren't as invested in this. I mean, people like David Chandler, for example, he did a lot of firsts in not just the truth movement, but in terms of just analyzing the collapses scientifically. He was the first one to actually measure the downward descent of the upper section of the North Tower, for example. And he found that it actually accelerates constantly through it, which nobody had done at that point. Nobody who had ever looked at these building collapses had ever done that. And he did that in 2008. So, a full 7 years went by and nobody actually thought to do a real detailed measurement of the descent of the upper section. And that itself is a huge anomaly. So I think there are just certain things that maybe people in the engineering community aren't aware of. And then when they are made aware of it, they do tend to think, well, yeah, even if they're not convinced of demolition, they do seem to think that reinvestigating or reanalyzing how these buildings came down is warranted. I do think they don't consider the debate resolved. They actually want to know more about how these buildings may have come down or may not have come down.
There was also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this too. In 2019, there was a draft report by researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks led by Leroy Halsey, following a 4-year computer modeling study, which was funded by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, in which their findings contradict those of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, otherwise known as NIST, which concluded in a 2008 report that World Trade Center 7 was the first tall building ever to collapse primarily due to fire. Can you give a fuller explanation regarding this study and what they found?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not the best person to talk about the findings of it. It's a pretty deep, in-depth study. I think it did find a lot of things that we had sort of noted previously, things like how there were certain construction details that NIST seemed to not give an accurate reading of. For example, the sort of plate stiffeners or the flange stiffeners that were located on the beam connected from column 79 to column 44 that they claim had to have been pushed off of its seat to initiate the collapse. That was a really, really bizarre omission from the NIST report, and seemed to contradict their assertion that that failure of that beam could have caused or could have initiated the collapse. And that's something that I know they do highlight in the report. I think there's a lot of problems with the NIST report on Building 7, and I think the Halsey report is useful for looking at all these problems. They do a good job of highlighting all the issues with the NIST report. I don't think the case for that building being demolished is that it rests on the Halsey report. I think we can establish that even without it. And there's areas that we need to reinvestigate, regardless, even if the report wasn't made. We need to reinvestigate Building 7's collapse because, yeah, there's a lot of problems with the NIST report on Building 7 still.
I want to ask you a follow-up to that too. Would NIST also be in the same light as, say, the 9/11 Commission final report, where basically not everything in it was right, but not everything in it was wrong? What was it about the NIST report that was wrong about World Trade Center 7?
Oh, yeah, well, I totally agree. Like, I don't reject any of the NIST reports in their entirety. You know, they certainly get a lot of stuff right that they sort of, I think, couldn't avoid getting right because they have to describe the buildings correct in some manner. But I would say a lot of things that are highlighted by researchers have to do with, one, the construction of the building is not described correctly by NIST. One of the other things people have pointed out, this is first discovered by Chris Sarnes, who investigated this back in 2008. NIST in their draft report talked about how one of the things that led to Building 7's collapse was that the floors lacked, or at least floor 13, where the collapse is supposed to have started, lacked shear studs, which are basically these studs that tie the concrete floor slab to the steel beams. But then in their final report, they changed the wording a bit, where they tried to say that there were no shear studs in many of the core girders and beams. But the problem is that the beam that they talked about failing was technically not a core girder. It was located in the eastern region of the building, connected from column 79 to column 44. And I believe they also found construction documents that showed that, yes, there would have been shear studs installed on that floor. So, they're basically saying that the construction is really what they cite as one of the reasons the building collapsed. Like, they don't actually say that the fires themselves were particularly extraordinary. In their report, actually, in I think it's table 8-1 of NC Star 1-9, they do a comparison of Building 7 to other skyscrapers that have been on fire, like the First Interstate Bank and the One Meridian Plaza. And the reason I think they compared it to those buildings is because those were also core and perimeter structures, like Building 7 and the towers were. Not exactly the same, but the same general outline of construction. And they actually do say in their report that the fires in those buildings, which again didn't collapse from fire, that the fires in those buildings were just as severe and probably more severe than the fires in Building 7. So what they do in their report is try to say that there were specific things about the construction that led to the collapse of the building, things like the lack of shear studs and things of that sort. So they're trying to cite specific things that if these things had been in place, the building may not have collapsed. It's sort of similar to their statement in their report on the towers that what really contributed to the fires causing collapse was that the plane impacts dislodged the fireproofing. And they say that if the fireproofing had not been widely dislodged, the buildings probably would not have collapsed. So they seem to find things like, they say like, oh, well, if it had this, yeah, they probably would not have collapsed. And the key thing is to look into, well, is that actually true? Like, did, the buildings actually lack the components they needed to stay up, or is it possible that they were still in place? And so by NIST's own reasoning, the building should not have collapsed.
Right, okay, and also to follow up on that as well, debunkers will basically say, well, if NIST is basically biased because they want to push a level of the state's narrative, well, then the Leroy Halsey report would be biased because they're funded by architects and engineers. What would you say to that?
Yeah, when it comes to this question of like the motivations, I don't usually like to ascribe that. I really want to focus on just like the science and the data itself, because it could be that, it could be that NIST is completely biased, that they're at the beck and call of their masters at the government. That still doesn't mean that anything they actually say in the report is wrong. Like, you actually have to look at the science of what they say. Now, I will say some of that is compromised by the fact that a lot of their conclusions are based on computer models, and the computer and the inputs themselves have not really been made accessible to other people. So it is a little harder to gauge how accurate their results are without being able to look directly at it, which, to their credit, the Halsey report, they did release all of their input data for people to look at. So I think they were at least a little more open in that regard. So I think they deserve some credit on that in that regard.
I'm a little bit more surprised at him as well by the 9/11 Truth Movement in not, I guess, publishing the Halsey report as much as they should, because I remember before it even came out, there was big talk about this report that was going to come out. And then when it didn't really gain as much fanfare online. Is that what you thought as well, or did you see differently?
I mean, I didn't see it as much. Now, granted, I am not as active in the movement as before, right, so okay. it's maybe harder for me to gauge that. But yeah, from what I've seen, it didn't quite gain as much fanfare, and maybe that's due to the fact that I don't know that it gained a whole lot of traction in the engineering community in general. I would like to see them push it more, to like take it to more, I guess, like engineering conferences. I think they did a little bit of that, but it'd be good for them to do that, to maybe publish maybe like a summary of findings in a peer-reviewed journal, for example, of the report, like a shorter condensed version. That would be great for them to do. I don't know why they haven't, but I think that would be a good thing for them to do.
I think I know why too, and this is in the direction that we're going to go into now. It's a direction that we both share a common investment in as of the last couple of years. It seems we have a common antagonist in Craig McKee, author of truthandshadows.com, who has made many ridiculously bad takes, specifically what took place at the Pentagon in Shanksville on September 11, 2001. You have published a paper entitled Lying for 9/11 Truth on the Pentagon and the Deceptions of Craig McKee back in 2014. Can you talk more about this for our audience, about how you came to write this paper?
Yeah, so I can't recall exactly how I even came across Craig McKee and his writings. I think back then he was just starting to get some traction in the truth movement, because I had never heard of him before then, I don't think.
Right.
But I was involved in some groups on Facebook, like Truth Movement Facebook groups, and somebody had posted a link to his article, as I recall. And it just contained a lot of the standard arguments you hear about why a plane couldn't have hit the Pentagon. And it cited that movie, I believe, called New Pearl Harbor.
By Massimo Mazzucco, right?
Right, yeah. Right. So, and I read it, and I immediately was catching all the errors in it. And so on my own personal blog, I wrote basically a rebuttal to his paper, or his article on his site, which was not well received by him and his followers on the site. And then it was like a year or two later, he was promoting this article again, and did not correct a mistake that I had cited in it, where the film talked about how the white blur you see in one of the frames of the infamous 5-frame video of the Pentagon strike, that the film was saying how that white blur you see is the edge of the plane. And I pointed out, no, that's not the edge of the plane. You can actually, if you look closely, you can see the actual plane and that the white trail is following it, that it's appears to be smoke coming out of one of the engines, either because it was damaged from hitting one of the light poles or as Ken Jenkins suggested, like some leaves and debris got caught in the engine and was burning it up and causing the trail behind it. And I pointed all this out, and because I had explained this to Craig and he was still promoting this thing and he had not corrected his article. And I kept asking him, why don't you correct this? You know, this is not true. I explained why it's not true. And he kept going into all these excuses for why he wasn't going to fix it. And he eventually even denied that he made that claim in the first place. And then I cited his own article to him and said, no, you did. Here's the passage where you say it. And then he said, oh, well, I guess I forgot or something. Like, we got into a whole big back and forth on Facebook. It was really frustrating. And to this day, he has still never corrected that article. Like I've explained to him why what he says in there is not true, and he just won't fix it. And he, to me, means that he has no problem. This is why I describe him as lying, because I've explained to him why it's not true, and he knows it's not true, but he doesn't want to correct it. He has no problem with his readers still seeing this and being misled by it, and that really, really gets to me. He's had all the time in the world to fix that. I know that his old site got taken down and then he made a new version of it. That would have been a great time to update that article. He still didn't do it. I don't know. He's a very, very frustrating person to deal with. I've had a lot of heated run-ins with him. And whether you're a truther or a debunker, if you're not getting the facts right about 9/11, it's one thing if you're getting it wrong just because you're not as informed about it, but he is informed about it. And so, yeah, that's why I don't think it's wrong to say that he's lying about this, because I don't know what other conclusion to come to.
Right. And you know what? You also published a follow-up paper just recently this year to McKee as well.
Yeah, because originally when I wrote my responses to him, it was like in 3 different blog posts, and I kind of just decided, well, let's put them all together into one paper so that people can see like the whole thing. I was actually kind of inspired to write it, sort of like, or re-inspired to like write that up, because I had seen your critique of his arguments from the 9/11 con that Richard Gage had recently hosted. I hadn't seen that before then, but when I watched that, I was pretty astounded and upset at the claims he was making, because they're so blatantly wrong and fallacious and also just old. Like, these are arguments that have been debunked a million times over, and he just acts like they haven't been debunked.
Yeah, there's not to harp on Craig McKee here, but I think the reason why we've become so critical of people like him is because we share a common aspect in that we want to see the truth movement actually right the ship, so to speak, because these people have taken the forefront and they become the popular voices of the time being. In that, I've always believed that people like yourself and David Chandler and Ken Jenkins, John Wyndham, always should have been that face of the 9/11 truth movement, the rational voices of the scientific community and the rational voices of the geopolitical movement as well, involved with 9/11. But they've taken almost like this back seat to it and allowed the fringe, irrational elements to become the forefront. And the media, they play right into it. And this is something that we're trying to dispel as well, because the media are jumping all over this, interviewing people like John Lear and Morgan Reynolds and Kevin Barrett, and basically, ignoring, there's a reason why they cut off that interview with Stephen Jones years ago. But these are the people that we should basically be interviewing, but instead they're being ignored. And there's like this concerted effort to show that the 9/11 truth movement, dare they question the government's narrative and ask for more information, that they're all in the same boat as these fringe conspiracy theorists led by people like Alex Jones and Jim Fetzer. Is that something that persuades you to be more critical to people in the truth movement?
Yeah, I think, like I said, writing at the Debunkers blog really gave me I think before I joined there, I like I said, probably had some of these tendencies that you see from these more fringe people to be sort of uncritical and apply sloppy methodology. But writing there, it really gave me a chance to kind of hone my skills in researching this. And the lesson that I really took away from it was you got to try as hard as you can to critically evaluate both sides equally. You know, you got to be able to look at this stuff as, you know, dispassionately as you can. I know for something like this, that's really hard to do, but we should at least try. And the thing that I really hate the most from people like Craig McKee, because I see this from him a lot, is he has this just awful tribalist mindset that he will go after people like David Chandler and Wayne Costi because, in his words, they're acting like debunkers. You know, he said things like that, you know, they've gone full debunker because they're trying to show that a plane did hit the Pentagon. No, what they're doing is they're trying to evaluate the evidence wherever it leads. And we cannot have this mindset that he seems to have, that just because it comes from the mouth of a debunker, it therefore must be wrong, which is not the case at all. What I've learned is that in evaluating what the debunkers are saying, that means being able to acknowledge when they get something right. And they do. You know, it's not just because they're debunkers, that means they're wrong. There is stuff they have been right about. And we can't get into this, like, and it's something I hate about it in general, that between truthers and debunkers, it became this kind of us versus them mentality, which I wish it didn't have to be. I don't see the debunkers as being like the enemies of the truth movement. That's not how I look at it. I don't agree with them for the most part. I think the conclusions that we come to are ultimately going to not be in agreement. But I try to look at the debunkers as just other 9/11 researchers, just on the opposite side of the spectrum. But I don't consider them the enemies of the truth movement. The only people that I think of as the enemies in this whole situation are the people that actually carried out the attacks, whoever they are. You know, they're the actual enemies in all this. The debunkers are people that we don't agree on or agree with on, but I do see them as, for the most part, people who are trying to research 9/11 and just coming to different conclusions.
Right. This is a war that I consider like this. To me, it's a two-pronged war. One's a war that is invaluable, and one is a war of a waste of time. And I condense it as like this: we have a war for information that we're trying to get and obtain from the federal government, which are not too keen on releasing information, and also the less important war, and that is a war of disinformation, dispelling it, which is coming from mainly the fringe elements of the truth movement, as well as certain elements of the debunkers as well. And it's basically just wasting resources and time regarding the more careful researchers such as yourself, in that if we just concentrated as a coordinated effort instead of a divisive issue, a divisive two-pronged issue, we probably could get more what we've got now, which is basically these fringe elements who are basically getting nowhere after 21 years. And I'm afraid this is exactly going in the same route as JFK, for example, where 65 years later, we are nowhere closer to the truth than now. Is that something? Is that something that you share as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know at this point if a new investigation will happen. Obviously, I think, like you, feel that the more and more time goes on, it seems like it gets less and less likely, for a number of reasons. Not just like the kind of waning interest of people in the topic, but the fact that evidence is not going to be around forever and might become lost or contaminated or whatever, and then we can't find the results no matter what we do. I still think, the reason that I still talk about this is because even if we don't get a new investigation, I still think it's important that people get the correct facts about what happened that day. We should not let history be distorted, and people should know what happened back then. And also as a way to sort of prepare ourselves for what may happen later on. What I've said is that if we don't get a new investigation, then the best thing that we can then do is to arm ourselves with at least a proper methodology to evaluate events that may happen, and maybe even work to prevent like the next 9/11s from happening. I think that's a very important thing that we all need to do, because so much changed after that happened, and you see the impact it had on not just America, but the entire world. And I really do hope that the lesson a lot of people can take from that is we've got to look at these events more critically. We've got to go through this stuff with a finer comb and not just kind of brush it off as something that happened, that something terrible is going to occasionally happen, and we just have to accept that's the way it is. We need to be more aware of this stuff, and we need to be able to, again, if not get justice, at least make sure people are better informed so that we can work to prevent these things from happening in the future.
Sure. You know what? I do want to get your thoughts on, like, because I hear it all the time that we need a new investigation to 9/11, in which, I'm fully behind that. But, in your opinion, what would that new investigation look like, and who would it be carried out by?
Well, I don't have an exact outline of how it would be done. I do think that if there was going to be a new investigation, if there was like a tribunal, I think it should be an international tribunal, because like I just said, this really affected the entire world and still affects the entire world. It's hard to, I don't think it can just be in the hands of people within the US, for example. I think we need to get potentially other countries from other agencies from other countries invested and involved in this. From there, I'm not exactly sure what shape it would take. I think there's other people that would be probably better at, getting a grasp of how to go about investigating it. I think the main thing is that with the investigations that have been carried out so far, there needs to be better access to whatever information that they had access to. Like I had said, NIST computer inputs, like having direct access to the computer inputs they used. Things like the evidence that the 9/11 Commission had access to. There was a lot of things that they were able to get access to that we don't have. They reference it in the commission report that what they use, but we don't have access to that. And I think that just a more free access to the information and evidence is what we would need, and given to other independent investigators who are able to analyze this stuff more closely.
So, Adam, I would love to get your thoughts about where do you see the truth movement, the 9/11 truth movement going today, and what would you change about it in the direction it needs to go in the future, if any?
Sure. I've given my thoughts on this before. It's specifically because again, it's what I've looked into the most, like investigating the collapse of the towers. Recommendations I've made is there needs to be a more, I think, concerted effort on the part of people like AE 9/11 Truth to get more people from the scientific and engineering community to look into this. One thing I would really like to see them do is maybe make more of an effort to get papers on this topic published in engineering journals. That's something I would like to see a lot more of. Now, some of them have, people like Tony Sambodi and people like Stephen Jones, obviously in his group, and others have done that, and I think that's great. But I just can't help but think about the fact that AE 9/11 Truth has over 3,000 members now, and I always give the example of if just 100 of them each tried to publish a paper in a journal, I'm sure some of them would be rejected, but a lot of them probably wouldn't be, and they could probably get more papers in journals. And that's how you get the attention of the wider academic and scientific community, by publishing in journals or going to conferences, which they've done a little bit of too. But I like to see more of that, because that's how you participate really in the wider conversation about what happened to those buildings, is you try to reach out more, and you publish in a format that can be properly reviewed and vetted by other experts in the field. So I'd like to see more of that go on.
And what about you, Adam? What about you as a person? Are you more? Would you be more active now than ever because there is this lull in the truth movement, or do you wish to remain independent, outside, or are you not interested in 9/11 at all?
Well, I'd certainly say it's not that I'm not interested at all. I'm always going to be interested. I'm always going to care about this topic very deeply. I know back in 2017, I had posted something on my old blog where I kind of basically said I was retiring from the movement, and that's still kind of the case now. I do pop in occasionally to do what I can. I'm certainly not as active as I once was, because I do think that, yeah, at some point the movement did kind of hit a wall. I think at some point the momentum was kind of lost, and it's been in a lull ever since then. I'd like to see something happen that could potentially get the energy back in the movement. You know, it's often said that the movement peaked in 2006 with that, you know, big rally in New York where you had like thousands of people, you know, demonstrating in the streets. And I think that might be kind of true. I don't think there was ever as big a demonstration back then. But what I kind of felt like in 2008, I felt like we kind of got the second wave of the truth movement in the form of possibly like the academic aspect of it. You know, that was the first year that we were getting papers published in journals besides the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And for a while, that's kind of where I had my hopes set. I kind of thought, well, maybe the activist aspect of the movement is kind of waning, but maybe this is the time when the more academic aspect of it is going to come into play. And maybe that will be, you know, the way that we will ultimately get a new investigation. Now, unfortunately, I think even that's kind of waned a little bit. So I don't know. I think something needs to happen to kind of reinvigorate either one or both of those aspects, the activist aspect and the academic aspect, to kind of galvanize people to take a bigger interest in it. I'm not sure what that could be, but if that did happen, I would happily be right there with everybody, trying to participate. As it is now, I'm trying to, like I said, pop in and do what I can when I can, but I can't say that I'm really very activist at this point in it. You know, I devoted over a decade of my life to this, and I certainly support the cause no matter what, but I also try to be realistic and know that there's times when you maybe need to understand that, yeah, this may not happen, and you should try to enjoy your life as much as you can, and not let it just consume your life. Otherwise, you're going to destroy yourself in the process.
Sure, but you know, I don't usually say this to many of my guests, but I would love to see you become more active. I think you're an invigorating and very intelligent voice within the truth movement, and one that is desperately needed now more than ever. And you know, that's just my opinion. I would like to see more of Adam Taylor than I'd say more of Craig McKee, for example.
Well, I'll just add that I think another thing just to keep in mind is I think if I had more of an outlet as well to get the word out, I probably would. But the thing about me is, yeah, I'm just one guy, and I've kind of expressed some frustration with AE 9/11 Truth. I think a lot of what they've done is really good, but you know, like I said, there's other things they could be doing that's better. But you know, like I said, I'm just one person, and I'm not going to change their minds. And they have an audience that I don't have, so it's a little harder for me to get the word out without having like proper outlets like they do.
Adam Taylor, contributing author to scientificmethod911.org and AE911truth.org. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me, Adam.